Well, good afternoon, everyone. And we are continuing with the externalization of the hierarchy, a series of articles and essays spanning quite a few years, really almost almost 30 years, really. And we are working on the dual forces which tend towards opposite directions. And we are speaking about the sweeping away of the evil forces and who will be the emerging avatar. This material is written in September, I think, of 1940, and the mode of the Christ reappearance and whether perhaps some other avatar would be coming to the aid of humanity. All of this was not yet completely determined. But let's just say the purpose of it all is to mobilize those people who and nations who are not really taking sides yet in the second phase of the Great War, which we call World War II. And Master DK is telling them, instructing them about the dire consequences of their neutrality, which may make it possible for the forces of enslavement to win the battle and send humanity into a condition of great retrogression. So, as a little segue here, I present this possibility to your attention and would ask you to think about it thus. If this should prove the correct result of all invocation and prayer, we shall have the balancing of the personality will of material selfishness and acquisitiveness, and, on the other hand, the selfless will which seeks to aid the whole of humanity. At the time this was being written, the continued successes of the Axis powers, especially of Germany, threatened to overrun the forces of light or their representatives. The will of the lower self and the will of the capital self, or capital S soul, will be brought into conflict with each other, with humanity throwing the weight of its influence upon one side or other. And as it turned out, because we have the advantage of retrospection, the great majority of humanity threw its weight upon the side of the forces of light, and thus there was the emergence from World War II with the Allies winning. Why spend so much time on World War II? I think because it was at that point that a decisive victory occurred in what the Tibetan is calling Armageddon, and this would allow the Christ and his hierarchy to return into visibility and would stage the proper entry of humanity into the Aquarian age. Aquarius would have come anyway, but as stated, since it is a great sign of distribution, great negativity might have been distributed. Certainly, the atomic bomb was Aquarian in nature, and the release of energy and the conversion of what appeared to be matter into light and heat, into energy, was a great moment in the dematerialization of the consciousness of humanity. So he's speaking of the great beings who might be called upon, might be properly invoked for a divine intervention, but they cannot be reached except through clear thought activity. Now, this was before, of course, the Lords of Liberation responded, and it appears that their response began when the sun moved northward in 1942. The defeat of the Germans at Stalingrad was the externalization of that inner turning, which meant that interiorly the war had been won, however many years it took to work out that victory upon the physical plane. Certainly people like ourselves would not be doing what we are doing now in connection with the great teaching if the Axis powers, the forces of enslavement, had prevailed. So it was a turning point. Now, whether or not it was the Armageddon foretold in the Bible, or whether that Armageddon lies in at some future date, has yet to be determined, but it seems from both those who knew Agni Yoga well and from the Tibetan here that the second phase of the Great War, World War II, that is the second phase, was the Armageddon. Now, that does not mean that the forces of darkness and their representatives do not continue to fight to achieve their objectives, and they do so in a very subtle way, and the weaponry available today, in contrast with what was available 80 years ago, or 75 years ago, this weaponry could wipe humanity off the face of the earth, and the whole experiment in some way would have to be restarted. So there's no way that we can relax thinking somehow that the Armageddon has passed and now Christ will reign securely for 1,000 years, symbolic 1,000 years. We have to give every effort that we have to counter what appears to be a kind of last-ditch stand or fight of the forces of materialism, which is occurring before the great conclave of 2025. We must resist with everything we have and set on their proper paths constructive actions which will lift humanity out of its glamorous and illusory condition of consciousness. So let's go on here a little bit. When I speak of throwing the weight of human influence upon one side or another, I refer not alone to thought power and to what so many euphemistically call work on mental levels. I refer to the conscious activity of the whole man, working mentally, emotionally, and most emphatically physically as well. I suppose he was, dealing with a lot of Ray 2 types, and in the world at this time, that particular type of soul is in abundance. And there may be a hesitation in that type of individual to work physically upon the physical plane, more so than the first ray, third ray, fifth ray, or seventh. So it's the entire process that is required. All aspects of the human being engaged in throwing the weight of their powers upon whatever side they choose, with the great majority choosing the side of good. Only those, therefore, who are integrated personalities can work in this manner, and herein lies the difficulty. Well, and you know, what I said before about second-ray souls, I have to qualify that. There is a considerable presence of those upon the second ray at this time. It may be waning now a bit. Excuse me. But not until the time approaching the first initiation, or at that initiation, can a change be made from a ray of attribute into such a ray, into rays of aspect, such as the first and the second ray. The transfer onto the third ray soul does occur earlier, when human beings reach the stage of intelligence, but it all starts with rays of attribute, 4, 5, 6, 7, being exclusively the soul rays of human beings. We have that information in the book, The Rays and the Initiations. So the whole man must be engaged mentally, emotionally, and physically, all of this integrated under the personality ray, which is, as it were, a subray, or acts as a subray of the soul ray. Those people today who work only mentally, or who sit and send thoughts of love broadcast into the world, and who bask thus in the beauty of their own idealism, making frequently no adequate balancing physical effort to bring this evil situation to an end through right choice, sacrifice, and strenuous service, are in reality of no service at all to any except themselves. Another straight communication, another, kind of indictment of what so many practice and think it to be of value. It is not of real value. Of course, there are powerful meditators, and as they reach the higher levels of their initiatory development, they may isolate themselves apparently from the fray, but they have the power in that apparent isolation to participate in the fray and to be there. Master Moria speaks of this, that the yogi, apparently isolated in the cave, can be very present any place in the world and participating extensively in the places of need. But for the average person, it can be an avoidance. Like all we do here, we just meditate. We don't do anything practical. But I have seen places dedicated to meditation alone who also do practical things on behalf of humanity. They send out literature, they correspond, they make sure that there are adequate communications to people who might be interested in pursuing the spiritual path. So every case has to be evaluated on its own merits. There are those who send thoughts of love to the group of evil men who are responsible for world disaster, believing thereby to influence them for good. I would remind them that love is essentially an impersonal potency or energy, dependent for its effect upon the type of form which it contacts and upon which it makes its impact, pouring therefore upon the selfish materialistic nature. It will only enhance desire and promote increased acquisitive aggression. To that type of activity, acquisitive aggression, we can relate the sign Taurus, but not exclusively, of course. Uh, and thus foster the lower nature and distort the true expression of love, leading, we would say instead, to increased evil activity. Okay, so it's something that has to be avoided. Now, the will of the soul, when pouring upon such individuals, may be a different thing. And the soul will handle the discipline that those types of human beings need and will regulate the karma which must come as a corrective. Pouring upon the selfless, the pure and the disinterested, that means the unbiased, those who do not seek anything for the personal self, it will foster reality and true love. These are points which should be remembered at this time by the well-intentioned but occultly ignorant server. I do remember reading this long ago, and I thought this really must be absorbed by naive people who think that love alone conquers all, regardless of the form upon which it is poured forth. So this is something for us to think about when we direct our thought, if we do, towards those who are creating distress in the world because of their selfishness. I sometimes think the power of substitution is better, and that to see the good emerging around such types and driving away the selfishness and driving them away from the seat of power and mischief might be a sounder way to proceed. So let's not be numbered among the well-intentioned, but occultly ignorant server. Yeah, there's so many things we have to learn here, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It is absolutely true of the novice who is beginning a certain kind of study and thinks after a few pages he's grasped what must be done. Let us now proceed to the analysis of the 3 stanzas or verses. The first of these refers to the waiting, attentive group of spiritual lives who seek to aid when right demand coincides with right time. Okay, so there are, verses within the stanzas. It appears that that's how he looks at it. The second stanza, or maybe it's stanza. Okay, what do we have here? 3 stanzas or verses. It's either one. Okay, it's either one, and then 3 parts to the overall massive great invocation. So We can refer to the divisions within any of these great invocations as stanzas or verses. 3 stanzas or verses. Yeah. The second stanza refers to humanity and its reactions and to the possibility of interplay between the two groups of spiritual lives and of men, of human beings. And the third indicates the methods and results. So we will take each separately, and this is going to be a very important section, because increasingly it is my impression that since the forces of darkness are not yet entirely neutralized and driven back, that this type of invocation will have to be used. We will take each phrase or expressed idea separately. So we have the idea of stanza, verse, phrase, and expressed idea, with the latter two being parts of the first two. Okay. For each carries its own import, and all of them possess several significances. This is the thing about Master DK. He understands the levels of communication and who it is that can appreciate these different levels and who it is that will not notice them. With all the meanings I cannot deal, but will present the simplest and the most important. Okay, so here we go, and this is 22 minutes into our process. Okay. Let the lords of liberation issue forth. Let them bring succor to the sons of men. Relief from distress, nourishment, sustainment, support, all of these things that the sons of men in dire difficulty at this time needed. Who are the lords of liberation, and from whence do they come? And we have speculated on this before. Are they extraplanetary, or are they shambolic beings, or are extraplanetary lords represented by extensions or emanations which are shambolic beings? All the ideas and concepts which control human life and have given rise to our civilization have started as emanations from certain great lives who are in themselves an expression of a divine idea. So I'm going to, indicate this, and I will say that ideas and beings may be considered the same. An incorporeal being, that's what an idea is. Ideas, emanations, beings, all the same. The note they strike, these great beings that are responsible for our rising civilization, and of course here DK does deal with the word emanations. In Buddhism, it's a huge subject. I had not been a student of Buddhism, but I hit upon the idea of emanations as a core element in understanding how the wide variety of ever attenuating and circumscribed beings arise. So the whole study of emanation theory is of extreme importance. The note they strike and the quality they emanate reaches out and makes an impact upon the most developed of the sons of men found at any particular time on earth. Not all, obviously, can be responsive to the high note, which is expressive of their nature. These, the sons of men, then proceed to make the sensed idea their own and to familiarize the thinkers of their time with the formulated concept. And basically what that means is the intuitives contact the thinkers. So the intuitives receive and carry the impression to the thinkers. In this way, great motivating divine purposes become controlling factors in human progress. There's always some kind of magical step down process which makes available ideas, energies, beings of very high vibratory nature to those who could not withstand the presence of the true nature, but who can at least fathom or be impressed by or work with an attenuation of the original nature. In this way, great motivating divine purposes become controlling factors in human progress. It is in this way that the basic urge to liberation and to freedom has slowly and consistently dominated human behavior. It sounds like this sounds like the influence of a Lord of Liberation, laughing out loud, you know. Anyway, Lord of Liberation. Oops. And those are the Lords of Liberation. Lord of Liberation, the very first of the Lords of Liberation, who has to do with freedom. And I suppose since the law of freedom has one of its important origins for us on the star Sirius, that this particular Lord would be connected with Sirius. It's kind of interesting because this Lord must also be connected with Uranus, the planet of liberation. Liberation then being a restoration to the archetype, rising out of one's limiting conditioning. And there is that descent of energies that goes Sirius, Pisces, Uranus, hierarchy, heart center, solar plexus center. So Uranus is definitely involved with Sirius, a Lord of Liberation whose nature is that of freedom, would be involved then with Uranus and with Sirius as well, because the great law of freedom, as far as we're concerned, is originating on Sirius. Now, where its ultimate origin may be, we're not in any position to determine, but all things, of course, come out of the universal logos, any universal logos in any universe. So in this way, that basic urge to, it is in this way that the basic urge to liberation and to freedom has slowly and consistently dominated human behavior. So from a Lord of liberation to practical reception and usefulness to humanity, leading first of all to the struggle for individual freedom, and liberation, which can be curtailed by the negative use of, let's say, Saturnian and Plutonic energy. The struggle for individual freedom and liberation with the incidental ideal of heaven, of initiation, and of spiritual attainment, we might say all all of these are forms of liberation, and gradually molding human thought to such an extent that the greater ideal takes shape. So from great beings, we might say, from, something happened, things are jumping. Okay, takes shape. So we would say that from great beings come the instigation for great ideals. Okay, so our best comes from above. The freedom of humanity and the liberation of its power to be self-determining, which is an aspect of freedom, okay, has become the dearest ideal and the best thoughts of the thinkers in all nations. In the last analysis, it is this interference with individual and group freedom which is the worst sin of the evil men who seek at this time to enslave the weaker nations and bend them to the rule of Germany, depriving them of their national assets and means of sustenance or subsistence, and wresting from them by force and fear their dearest possessions, liberty of life and conscience. Okay, well, so let's consider this then to be the worst sin of the evil types, depriving those they enslave of liberty of life and conscience. And there are many today in the world who would do the same, seeing themselves as the, narcissistically I might add, as the great force that is designed by providence to tell others what they may do and what they may not do. These dictatorial tendencies, as they usually initially manifest themselves, arise from what the Tibetan might call a very small personality. Okay, so, okay. So we have ideas, beings, and basic high energy units who impress the lower worlds with the qualities found at those higher points of tension and mold civilization then according to the higher purposes. That the lords of liberation issue forth, let them bring succor to the sons of men. They certainly were needed at the time, and you can see the Tibetan Rite in an almost surprised manner. I can't say it was entirely surprised, because he did foretell the possibility of that kind of intervention, but he said it might be unlikely. This we saw a few pages earlier. So all great ideas have their emanating sources of life, and therefore, and these are called in the ancient invocation with which we are occupied, lords of liberation. These great sources. Of course, I want to say this, that in the deeper sense, every emanation is an idea, a being, an entity. So we have to look for the equivalence of certain names and see, as we see the justification of that equivalence, really learn about a whole constellation of related thoughts and terms. A being is, an idea is a being incorporeal. I think this would be, a being without body. An idea is a being incorporeal. And that's usually we just say, oh, I have an idea, and we mean I have a thought. But an idea emanates from the realm of pure being, which is the foundation of all lesser beings as they appear within the universe, either in time and space as we know them, or time and space as we do not know them. So, emanating sources of life, I guess that's another name for these lords of liberation. See, we have to, be very sure about what we're invoking and to whom or to what we are addressing our invocatory demand or plea. And that's what this section is helping us do. They are 3 in number, and one of them is closer to the earth and to humanity than are the other 2, and it is he who can be reached by those who comprehend the nature of freedom. Liberty, he is liberty in a way. Freedom, liberty, and the other 2 are fraternity and equality. We usually say liberty, equality, fraternity, but I'm doing them in order. Aquarius, Gemini, Libra. Liberty, Aquarius. Fraternity, Gemini, and equality is Libra. If we're moving on the counterclockwise astrological wheel of evolution and not clockwise. So they are 3 in number, and one of them is closer to the earth and to humanity than are the other 2, and it is he who can be reached by those who comprehend the nature of freedom. Such great leaders as Roosevelt and Lincoln, and let's include Churchill, and I suppose in some way the Tibetan would include Ataturk. There have been great men inspired from above, great men and women, I must say, because when you look at the suffragette movement and the kind of freedom demanded by the women who insisted upon the woman's vote, we find great leaders. So they are three in number, and one of them is closer, and they can be contacted by those who desire beyond all things to be liberated and to see all the oppressed and enslaved people of the world liberated. Probably this would mean, when the Emancipation Proclamation was set forth by Lincoln and had to be voted on. By the way, in the film Lincoln, wonderful film with Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln. I mean, really, he became Lincoln. What you see there is probably some great Uranian Aquarian manifestation. A Uranian Aquarian manifestation. Now, Lincoln, we know, had the sun sign in Aquarius. Therefore, Uranus was the major ruler because it's not only the exoteric ruler, but it's a veiled hierarchical ruler, veiled by the moon. So it has a double presence, ordinary and extraordinary in that sign. And in the chart that I've done for Lincoln, and, consulting with his appearance, with a beard, without a beard, and so forth, and the manner of his assassination and so forth, it looks very much like Sagittarius is the rising sign, with the great compassion of Jupiter in Pisces, second-ray personality, first-ray soul, second-ray monad. I'm satisfied with it for the moment, although there has been a lot of question as what might be that rising sign. But in any case, he was a great Aquarian. We've just recently, within the last week, celebrated his birthday every February 12th. And Uranus, the planet of liberation, of freeing the slaves, we might say, would be prominent in his chart. And we have to consult that and wonder then at the time that the Emancipation Proclamation was being written whether that was a Uranian period in his life or in some other cyclic way. Every move of an enlightened consciousness, such as that of a Lord of Liberation, every move of an enlightened consciousness towards humanity produces a corresponding shift or move on the part of men. You wonder, with the freeing of the slaves, legally but immorally brought to America, whether that freeing occurred under some Aquarian Uranian aspect which invoked or evoked a Lord of Liberation, the one closest to us. So a shift on the part of men occurred, and a great civil war was fought over this question of slavery as it related to economics, a method of providing sustenance which relied upon plantations and slavery, and all of that shifted. So this shifting, this in itself, he says, constitutes a definite problem because no such move can be made by a Lord of Liberation unless humanity is ready to raise its ideal of freedom to a higher level of expression. Yeah, well, let's just kind of put that in red and read on. Why is it a problem? Because no such move can be made by a Lord of Liberation unless humanity is ready to raise its ideal of freedom to a higher level of expression unless the world war has in it the seeds of revelation of a higher human freedom, and unless humanity is ready to express this higher freedom to the best of its ability. It will not, unless all these things are so, it will not be possible for the lords of liberation to take action. So let's realize this interdependency and how the well-meaning greater beings, for the sake of those they desire to help, cannot take premature action unless there is a readiness on the part of those whom they seek to help. And I think this certainly relates to the reappearance of the Christ, unless humanity, probably out of distress, is actively invoking the Christ, and with much greater understanding about his divine nature than at present exists, then it will not be possible for the Christ to reappear. So, it's not a particular date on the calendar that will determine his reappearance into universal visibility, or at least planet-wide visibility. It is conditions fulfilled which determine the time of his reappearance. And that's why I say, we certainly have 100 years left. I've modified my view on this because at first, being less informed about the requirements for his reappearance, I hastened in my mind the time it would take. But it's not so. There are so many preliminary steps that have to be worked out. And we still are about 100 years out from the actual technical beginning of the age of Aquarius. Now, these lords of liberation, they cannot be moved by prayer, demand, or invocation alone. Such demand must have behind it the ideal of a newer freedom and a greater liberty for men. Yeah. Well, increasingly, we are going to be seeking liberation from selfish accumulation of world resources, which deprives the majority of human beings of that which they need to live constructively on this planet. Already the rebellion is setting in, and you can see it in the young people. They are not so frightened of giving up that which they know is impermanent, an impermanent possession anyway. You really can't take it with you. All you can do is take your attitudes, your consciousness, the skills you have developed, your understanding. You cannot take matter of the lower kind with you into the subtler worlds. Obviously, it just cannot work. You'd have to invert the way the planes are constructed. So, in the abrogation of French idealism, summed up in the words liberty, equality, fraternity, they do it in that order. It's as if one is moving from Aquarius to Libra to Gemini, but that would be a clockwise movement rather than the, in this case, spiritual counterclockwise movement. But maybe that's not so important right here. In the abrogation of the French idealism, summed up in the words liberty, equality, fraternity, the attention of the whole world was focused on the theme of liberty, and the symbolism of the event is of far greater importance. import than has yet been grasped. I suppose we're speaking about the fall of France and the fall of these great air sign qualities, liberty, equality, fraternity. So the home of the modern movement towards the liberation of humanity and the recognition of each human being's equality as a monad and the essential brotherhood that must exist between human beings on a higher level in the fall of the civilization or the country that espoused these great qualities. There was a victory for the forces of darkness, and people looked on with sadness that the home of these great ideals or ideas should be so compromised. But France, in its inner recesses, never gave up. France has not relinquished the ideal of human liberty, which she originally bought on a large scale, or brought on a large scale, to the attention of mankind. Even though the French Revolution eventually spun out of control and monarchy returned for a time, the idea had been anchored. So even though France fell, the idea of human liberty was sustained. Her action under the influence of the enemies of human freedom simply focused the danger with which humanity was confronted and brought it emphatically to the attention of humanity, numbed by disaster and bewildered by the accumulated weight of misery. So there was some perhaps advantage to seeing the fall of France as a great moment of warning, as DK says, focusing the danger. So, because, it's possible to become so inured, so too accustomed to a disaster-filled world that no disaster makes an impact upon one or is recognized as such. When, let's just say, we have some political events going on in the United States which are so much out of keeping with the dignity and values of American government that people become numbed to the constant negative changes. So anyway, the focusing of the danger occurs, and then maybe people will wake up, the neutrals and others who are withholding their support. By so doing, in other words, because the danger was focused and more deeply understood, by so doing, the problem was simplified for the untrained mind. It also produced, spiritually speaking, a direct line of communication between men who know the significance of freedom and long for human release, and the lords of liberation who are responsible for implanting this innate desire in humanity. So there was a linking up with great sources of potential liberation. Such was the disaster, it was recognized, and the spiritually minded sought to link up with some sort of heavenly agency which could bring release and relief, and at length it did. So Sanat Kumara can always bring good out of evil. And the fall of France was a great evil, but it was an awakening evil and mobilized the French resistance, of course, and those who supported the cause of freedom all over the world. When you think about it, of course, none of the Axis powers supported the idea of individual freedom. The state was always entitled to annihilate the individual, or at least tread upon the individual's responsibilities. Okay, so he's telling us something about the Lords of Liberation, and I guess the hint is that they do come from far away, and maybe have linked themselves to Shamballa at this time, just the way the Spirit of Peace had done, and just the way a bit later the Avatar of Synthesis had done. There's a great mutual cooperation, and we cannot think that the great beings such as planetary logoi do not have their superiors who act in a supportive and, kind of a parental role, just as we do for our children, and who come to the aid of the planetary logoi or even solar logoi so that next steps can be taken. I'm sure this exists as well on a galactic level, so far beyond the human range of comprehension as to almost annihilate the possibility of thinking about it. But we will learn, and we have been through this many times. We emanations of the One, we emanations of the One, and the One as well. We are both the One and an emanation of the One. The reason why these Lords of Liberation are the first mentioned in the stanza is that they are essentially related to desire/will and are therefore more easily contacted by man. Now, some people have wondered whether desire and will are parallel, and here we seem to see an expression that indicates that they are. It's been a question whether purpose is fundamental or will is fundamental to purpose. And I think, that the highest will is the energizer which sustains the coherence of purpose. Purpose is, I think, a relationship, and a will is a pure life-giving energy. It shall be or it shall not be, dealing with maybe what is the highest form of the will to be. The place from which they issue forth to the aiding of humanity is a certain area of the divine consciousness which is open to the human sense of awareness if sufficiently enlightened and selfless. Well, this sounds like at least they're working in an intra-planetary manner, and one does not at this time have to seek their presence in spaces to which one cannot possibly reach. So they issue forth, let the Lords of Liberation issue forth, let them bring succor to the sons of men. The place from which they issue forth to the aiding of humanity is a certain area of the divine consciousness which is open to the human sense of awareness if sufficiently enlightened and selfless. Well, there's just so many beings on Jacob's ladder, And here we go again for the umpteenth time. Always more times than one can specify. It's really a forever cyclic adventure. And if we try to locate it with concrete numbers, we will not succeed. We can call it the infinitive instance of universal appearance, but then are we trying to make a definite number out of infinity? Some have tried to do that, and the concept can be perhaps challenged at the very root. In other words, to deal with different kinds of infinities as if they had some definiteness about them and were elements and were somehow concretions. Well, the abstract mind is certainly needed when one deals with these things, and these beings are very much in universe, and they seem to be working through Shamballa because the will is ultimately liberating, and equality and fraternity ultimately are monadic states realizing identicality of origin and identicality of essence. So you can see from these above remarks how the effective use of the invocation is therefore dependent upon the point of spiritual development of the one who seeks the aid of true prayer and invocation. We are now at the 1 hour point, and the decision has to be made about continuing this program. 1 hour and 2 minutes. Okay. One thing which should be grasped anent all these great lives, notice how he capitalizes the word lives, indicating an elevation in status, is that what is commonly called worship is abhorred by them. They don't want to be worshipped. They want to be contacted with clear thought and with a realization of the value of the quality that they represent. Worship, the power to adore, and the sense of awe, which is one of the highest aspects of fear, are not desired by them. Yes. So, this is telling us right now how, if they ever have to be reached, they can be reached, and what not to do. Such attitudes are emotional in origin and based upon the sense of duality and therefore upon feeling. These lives are embodiments of service and can be reached by true servers with the appeal of service, and not because one wants to save oneself from unpleasantness or even disaster, but because one wishes to serve the welfare of others who, it just so happens, are really oneself. That particular type of registration is increasingly needed, however you or I can get there. So they can't be reached by emotion, but they can be reached by true servers with the appeal to service. Bear this in mind. As man progresses upon the path, he forgets worship. He loses all sense of fear, and adoration fails to engross his attention. All right, it seems almost inconceivable that we would drop even a high example of fear, that is awe, because I think, with the wonder of the new age, standing in awe of that which we will encounter in the new age, These don't seem like such bad things, but an entirely different approach is required as we venture into the higher vibratory conditions. So all these attitudes are obliterated by the realization of an overpowering love and its consequent interplay and tendency to increase identification. A very important sentence. Love increases identification. So love increases identification. And that, I think, we must really remember. I mean, why is it that the Lord of love, the Christ, is the one who has perfected, it seems, identification? I think, this can be operated with along the Neptunian ray 2 line, the second ray line of the Neptune monad, with which the Christ is endowed. So, not worship, not fear, not adoration, but instead the realization of an overpowering love. And that, as we cultivate that sense of love, it can indeed at times seem overpowering. What can you do with it? It's so amazing a realization. We are very, very far from, in general, from experiencing what the real love is, and it will intensify upon the path, and I believe, as it does so, amaze every one of us. So what we're being taught here is how to contact the first and nearest of the Lords of Liberation, who has to do with freedom, with liberty, and is vibratorily closer to humanity than the other two, although their day must come in the age of Aquarius, because decanates representing them will be taking place, will be part of the offering of Aquarius. Okay, love and its consequent interplay and tendency to increase identification. The Lords of Liberation can be reached, therefore, by the call of the world servers, and they will then issue forth through the agency of one of them who will unify the energies of all three, and so produce those conditions which will bring about effective and recognized freedom. So what we're doing here is seeing that some of our most cherished states of being are coming from higher beings, such as these Lords of Liberation. And we're learning that these great states towards which we aspire descend from above. And we have to learn the right means of invocation. Now, of course, this is an ancient mantra, and said together by sufficient numbers with sufficient understanding and intensity can be maybe the most effective way of evoking through invocation the Lords of Liberation, especially at this time, the first and nearest of these lords. So they will, this is 1940, the energies of all three are unified as one of them steps forth as the representative, probably the Lord of Freedom, and so produce those conditions which will bring about effective and recognized freedom. Now that can be a bit terrifying. I'm remembering, did I read, there was this psychologist social psychologist, I think, by the name of Erich Fromm, and probably some of you have read him. He was a powerful thinker, and he was analyzing the authoritarian Nazi mentality. He was doing this after the war. I think he was a Jew. He had a unique perspective on it and was very comprehensible. And one of his books was called Escape from Freedom. Escape from Freedom. Okay, I was interested in reading this when I was a student in the university. How they will do this is not for us to say, because I don't know if DK foresaw the bending of the stream of mental quest sent forth by the Nazi scientists, the bending of that stream away from the knowledge that it sought, and instead the facilitation of the acquisition of that type of knowledge by the scientists in the Allied group. How they will do this is not for us to say. The most probable method will be through the overshadowing of some man or group of men, so that they will be inspired to bring about victory, the victory of liberty. Well, and here's the question. Was the Manhattan Project for the building of the atomic bomb, and which went on in New Mexico for some time, was that an overshadowed project? We're getting so much help from inside. We're not supposed to become dependent upon it, but we certainly are to recognize it if we can, and to become increasingly grateful. So there is, let the Lords of Liberation issue forth. Let me just see exactly what it is here. Yes, let them bring succor to the sons of men. Yes, okay. So, we are on what page are we on? 265. And now we are further along. We began at 265. I'm just trying to locate us. 269. So this is so far. Whoa. I wonder if it would ever be possible. Okay. Yeah. From 265 to 269. I'm just going to take a little break because that the rider from the secret place come forth and coming save. So it's going to be let the rider from the secret place come forth and coming save. Come forth, O mighty one. And this rider is a mighty one indeed. And so are the Lords of Liberation and any of the high beings of which we are speaking at this time. Let the rider from the secret place come forth and coming save. Come forth, O mighty one. I'm just going to take a little break here, and we'll get into the discussion of the Kalki avatar and the rider from the secret place. Yes, he is the rider from the secret place. And we, human beings, we are open to him, and increasingly, as we discover that we cannot really solve the problems we have generated, but there are those on this planet to whom we are related who can solve the problems or at least indicate to us how they may be solved, then there will be a recognition of the hierarchy and cooperation with them. Okay, so my goal here is just to prepare for the next presentation, the next phrase, the next sentence. That's what we're doing. Right. Okay. All right, friends, I'll be back before long, and we've done about 4 pages here and maybe an hour and 15 minutes worth of work together. You know, sometimes as I do this, you've probably noticed there are sharper moments and duller moments, and I just have this will to persist in it, even though at times it may seem that I'm talking in my sleep. So I hope I'm not boring you, and I hope that no huge non sequiturs occur from visiting the dream world and then coming back to the world of commentary, back and forth. Anyway, plowing on. Now I think we can go on a little more. I'm not sure I'll be able to finish this section. I think it's a long one about this particular phrase, and we do have the Pisces full moon broadcast meditation coming up in the year 2019. Whenever you happen to be listening to this, if you've come this far, let the rider from the secret place come forth, and coming save. Come forth, O mighty one. Now here we come up against one of the oldest traditions in the world, and of the ancient East, one to which finds its counterpart in the New Testament, where the coming one is seen coming forth to rescue the people, riding upon a white horse. I suppose that's the way the Christ is anticipated, or whoever takes the place of the Christ, depending on the era. But this seems to be the era for which this invocation is designed. In the Occident, we have for long thought in terms of the, quote, Lamb slain from the foundations of the world, close quote, and in this statement lies a profound astrological truth. Now, because it's the Lamb, is this related to Aries, and a large Aries cycle. It refers to that great round of the zodiac, a period of approximately 25,000 years. You know, we call it a great Platonic year, in which the sun passes through all 12 signs of the zodiac. The period to which reference is made started in the sign Aries, the ram, and Aries colors the whole of it. Now, there's something still more ancient here. The Orient, however, harks still further back to a much earlier period. Let's see, and to a still more ancient date, remote in the night of time. Now, remember, these great ages are moving in a counterclockwise manner, and so it would be Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra, Virgo, etc., until we reach Aries. And even if we forget the overlap periods and just calculate the 25,000 years, we have Sagittarius 1, Scorpio 2, Libra 3, Virgo 4, Leo 5, Cancer 6, Gemini 7, Taurus 8, and Taurus and Aries. Well, after 8, we are at 200,000 years before the previous age of Aries. So we still have 200,000 years to go. Putting that all together as maybe related to a great 250,000 year cycle, if we consider the compression that we might achieve through overlapping periods. I think we don't have the real numbers here, and I think they are part of the secrets of initiation. So the Orient, however, harks still further back to a much earlier period, about 200,000 years. Let's see how we do this. Yeah. Yeah. So we are moving in reverse. We're moving in a reverse manner, and it will take 200,000 years to go in a reverse manner to Aries again if we go backwards through the zodiac of constellations. Okay, years, approximately. Okay. And that is to a still more ancient date, remote in the night of time, when the greater world cycle, and what do we mean by that? What is that greater world cycle? So what is this? Is this a round? Because rounds last millions of years. Is this a transit through a globe of the round? Is this simply a cycle of 250,000 years that it takes our 7 solar systems to revolve around the Pleiades, according to the occult teaching anyway, and not really supported by the scientists of the day? So a greater world cycle, or is it simply the 25,000 year cycle, or almost 26,000 years, depending on how we count it, which started in the sign Sagittarius? Okay. So, there are different ways of looking at this. See if we go backwards from Aries. We have Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Sagittarius is about 100,000 years, and it would take that long to reach from an age of Aries to an age of Sagittarius. On the other hand, from Sagittarius to reach the future age of Aries would take the period that I'm talking about here, 200,000 years. The whole cycle, looked at this way without overlaps, would be a 300,000 year cycle. It's 25 times 12, but with overlaps, I think we're closer. The kind of overlaps we're talking about, I think we're closer to the 250,000 years, which correlates with that great revolution of our solar system and the associated solar systems around the Pleiades, considered to be the very center of the one about whom naught may be said, at least that particular one with whom and with which we are involved. So, a time remote when the sign Sagittarius governed the greater cycle, and we don't know whether it was a time 100,000 years ago, or whether we had to go all the way around again the entire zodiac and have the different signs begin the cycle until we came to Sagittarius again. And we're traveling in this manner clockwise and not anti-clockwise. Okay, well, about these greater world cycles, we have some hints, but until we have achieved something we call kind of all knowledge on the atomic plane, there are always going to be mistakes and misapprehensions. So we're talking about very ancient times anyway. The lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now, we can talk about that as the beginning of the age of Aries, at a lesser age, 30 degrees of Aries and moving in a clockwise direction. And that would have, taken place maybe, if you said, let's just say 2,500 years marks each cycle, maybe 5,000 years ago. But we're probably talking about larger cycles. So it's when, in fact, the cycle, the great cycle, began with the sign Aries. Now, the greater cycle is 25,000 years, roughly. We've just finished one of Pisces, and at the beginning of Aries, another 25,000 years in earlier historical moments would have been ahead of the progress of the Platonic year, and we'd be dealing more like 50,000 years. So moving, clockwise from the end of Aries to its beginning, from the end of Pisces to its beginning, about 50,000 years would have elapsed. So let's look at this. 50,000 years or so would have elapsed from the clockwise progression of a Platonic year, beginning at the end of Aries and then moving through the end of Pisces until now, when the end of Aquarius is the entry point. So each one of these would be 50,000 years, and basically we have, let's see what it would be here. If I have it up, yeah. So this would be 12 times 25,000. Okay, let's clear there again. Okay, so it's 12. Right. times 25,000. I think I've already given that figure. No, I haven't. That's 300,000 years, yes, and it's an approximation of the 250,000 year cycle. So I really wouldn't want to hazard a guess here as to how all of these cycles work out. I'll just say that vast periods of time are involved in the astrological history which relates our planet to other solar systems and especially to our solar logos. Now, different planets are experiencing these zodiacal ages at different times depending upon the inclination of their axis. It is not going place uniformly. In other words, when we're having a great 25,000 year age of Aquarius, other planets with different axial inclinations are not having Aquarius as the ruler of any such zodiacal periods. And of course, that somehow involves quite a complex mathematical estimation. But suffice it to say, the zodiac of constellations are ruling these Platonic years as they appear on the different planets. And the different planets are all of them having different emphases. Now, I realize that's, pretty vague statement, but nevertheless, I think we can get the idea that all these different qualities are being sponsored within the solar system at the same time. Earth may be experiencing quite imminently a shorter age of Aquarius, and in times to come and not very far ahead, a great age of Aquarius. And the question is, I suppose, since the great age of Pisces is over, and well, it's almost over anyway, is this sign Aquarius, through which we are passing, part of that, the ending of that great age, or is it part of the beginning of a great age of Aquarius? I think he tells us our science cannot determine the beginning of these greater ages, which are essentially Platonic years, and run through 12 of the 2,500-year periods, or maybe more accurately, 2,160-year periods. And maybe we can calculate how long a great age, that is a Platonic age, actually lasts by looking at not the number 2160, but the number 21600, 21,600. Now that would be interesting. I hope I'm not off on some kind of little rant here that leaves everybody wondering what in the world I'm talking about. But let's just say 21,600 times 12 equals what? Well, we're much closer, aren't we, to the 250,000 year period. And maybe when we take in some of these overlaps, because, 2.5 degrees on either side of the cusp of a sign gives us qualities of both signs. And then there's a 250 year and 250 year, which is a 500 year overlap period for the smaller age, and maybe a 5,000 year overlap period consisting of 2,500 and 2,500 related to these greater ages. I just have to take the Tibetan's word for it at the moment that it's not exactly the beginning and end are not subject to the knowledge that we possess with our scientific methods, but if we bring the rounded off 25,000 year period down to 21,600, which is an expansion of the, 2160. Now maybe what we've done there is add another, we multiplied it by 10, I think, and added another 0. Okay. And we've brought it up to a higher level. A 2,500 times 10 is 25,000. I do believe that's the case. Now let's just make sure that I'm correct. Whoops, that's not going to work. 2,500 times 10 equals, 25,000. So increasing by a factor of 10 is correct. Now we don't know whether the actual spans of the Platonic year are 21,600 years, all based upon the number 432, which is found in the Brahmanic chronology, and divide that, you get 216 and 2160 and 21600. But there is a possibility, in any case, we're closer to the approximately 250,000 year cycle of our solar system and its associated solar systems around the central point, the Pleiades. Now, I think, that a little bit of exposure to this shows everybody how little I know, and tells us something about how deep the knowledge would have to go to determine with accuracy these cycles. Now, the hierarchy will never release the actual figures because too much could be calculated from them, and the result could be very unfortunate, falling into the wrong hands. So basically what we have here is something that is a rounded off presentation, but gives us an idea of the relative scope of these cycles and greater cycles in which we are participating. Suffice it to say, we will soon be entering a great age of Aquarius, and at a time which is given a lesser equinoctial age of Aquarius of approximately 2,500 years, but maybe closer to 2,160 years, based upon the root figure of the Brahmanic chronology, which is 432. So the practical part of this is to say that whatever Aquarius really represents will be in a very large way behind human progress and planetary development for about 25,000 years. And that Pisces has been equally responsible for humanity's development and planetary process for an earlier 25,000 years, which may still be at the moment operative. We just don't know when in the fairly imminent future that period will end, the Piscean period will end probably at the moment. My guess is that we are very much within a 5,000 year overlap period between the Platonic year of Pisces and the Platonic year of coming Aquarius. Well, okay, before I get myself in more trouble, I think I'll move on, just in the hope that we realize what the main energies will be and that we're just at the threshold of it. So, the Orient, however, harks still further back to a much earlier period and to a still more ancient date, remote in the night of time. If it's remote in the night of time, these figures may look a little bit too small. So, going clockwise from 25,000 Aries, it would be more or less 100,000 years and multiples, times 12, and so forth. In other words, it could be 1,200,000 years if we multiply this by 12, and then we can continue to multiply by 12 and try to determine when this age of Sagittarius took place. It's not necessarily the one that occurred most recently. So I'll just say, if the starting point was the most recent Platonic year of Aries. Yes. And one day we will know these things when I think we are masters and the highest level of the atmic plane reveals to us the cycles involved, or at least let's just say developments, perhaps a liberation from a vehicle on the highest level of the atmic plane, or the highest Brahmic level, that is the third subplane, is our focus. Maybe a vehicle will be destroyed which brings us into a type of consciousness which can reveal the exact cycles. The symbol of this is sometimes towards the latter part of the cycle depicted as an archer. Notice the latter part, riding on a horse, and in the early part of the cycle as a centaur, half man, half horse. Now, one of the things that occurs to me, whether I'm right or wrong here, is that is each 250,000 year cycle also ruled by a particular sign of the zodiac, or let's just say constellation. In other words, we're in a 250,000 year cycle, and it recently came to an end, I think he says, around the time of the Christ, which would tell us something of the timing for his coming forth. Now, is that great 250,000 year cycle also ruled by one of our zodiacal constellations? So because we would get into a situation here that a complete cycle then would be 300,000 years, but we came down to 259,000 by reducing No, wait a second. No, this is millions of years. Millions of years. So let me get this straight. Here we go. All right. So let's say 200. I seem to be tenaciously dealing with this, even though I can't possibly know with accuracy how it should work out. So this is a 3 million year cycle, or maybe a 250 million year cycle. If, let's just say, if the number 12 conditions the cycle, conditions a cycle of 250,000 year periods, then we are dealing with a 3 million year greater cycle, or perhaps 2,500,000 year cycle. Well, we better not do too much of this. It's just that the figures are daunting, and we know it is all controlled, and it's probably all, controlled by the solar logos of our solar system, in relation to whom our planets are revolving and rotating and inclined on their axis in a certain way. And these are the great developmental cycles of every planet. And we've been through really quite a number of these cycles ever since individualization, and before individualization, when we just had these huge ape-like men and even etheric monsters, who had no self-recognition. So, I think I have to be turned in to the local mathematics professor for a scolding. Anyway, in this greater period of Sagittarius, the greater world cycle, what is this? So is this a period of 12 250,000 year cycles? Is it that? So it starts in the sign Sagittarius, the Archer. And we have the Archer, but eventually emerging from the Centaur, half man, half horse. How long does that take? Doesn't it seem that 25,000 years is too short a time? Maybe a larger cycle ruled by Sagittarius, a 250,000 year cycle, for instance, ruled by Sagittarius, is more appropriate. Okay, maybe it's not just going to be a scolding. Maybe they're going to kick me out of the university. But they can't kick me out of the universe. Anyway, let's wait a little while until we're masters. How long will that be? The time equation is often largely in our hands. Now, both refer to an emerging revelation of the consciousness of deity as revealed through some great divine expression, through some manifesting Son of God. So obviously the half man, half horse is much more animal in its nature. I'll never forget the time that an esoteric psychology class in New Zealand was on the second floor, and a kind of a rugby team was on the first floor. and I got to know what it was like to experience many centaurs, or maybe they were half man, half horse. Anyway, it was an amusing experience and was occurring as a method of illumination to all of us. The point to bear in mind is that the rider on the white horse is no extraplanetary entity or life, but is essentially one like unto ourselves, human and animal combined, as are we all, but fused with divinity and inspired from on high, informed by some cosmic and divine principle, as Christ was informed by the love of God and carried the revelation of love to man. Well, so that explains that he is the mighty one, I believe, relatively to us, but he is like unto us, and therefore what he has done, we can do, and he has said, greater things shall you do. Now, I've completely lost my chronology, so I'll just try to find when the right time to stop may be, and this is a long section, and we cannot finish it all now. I don't think so. The rider is one of our humanity who has reached a predestined goal and who, for very love and understanding of man, has remained for ages in the secret place of revelation, as it is esoterically called, waiting until his hour comes around and he can then issue forth to lead his people to triumphant victory. So the expectation of the return of the Christ is rooted in a very, very old tradition, and you kind of wonder, have there been various Christs or Bodhisattvas or leaders of the spiritual hierarchy who have issued forth carrying some form of revelation to the humanity of that period? Maybe not the opportunity for all or many to enter into the fifth kingdom of nature, as is now the case, but something needed, some great teacher who is the head of hierarchy coming forth. The coming one is on the path of a world savior, just as the more potent lives, the lords of liberation, are on the path of world service. Now, isn't that interesting? Because in this case, world service is put above world saviorship. Obviously, the scope of salvation of the coming one, this coming one anyway, is smaller than the scope of service distributed by a Lord of Liberation. So these Lords of Liberation, they issue forth. Okay, this is such important material, and obviously needs more reading than just this. They issue forth via the highest spiritual center, wherein the will of God is held in solution or custody, for gradual release or revelation, as humanity can arrive at the needed point of understanding, response, and receptivity. All right, so these, I guess, we're speaking of the Lords of Liberation, because the Christ, though he can come and go in the courts of Shamballa, is the head of the hierarchy and is focusing more within the triadal realms, I would guess. But he does have a place at the right hand of the Father, which is truly a Shambhalic realm. So, where he spends his time and his focus, that cannot be within our knowledge. But the Lords of Liberation, clearly here, they issue forth from Shambhala. Though they can be reached relatively easily, it must be through the massed intent of the many focused minds. So this is the Lords of Liberation. Through many focused minds, they are reached. Let's remember that. The rider on the white horse can be reached by the individual aspirant if he can raise his consciousness adequately high. So this somehow shows the necessary grouped or massed effect relative to the Lords of Liberation and the possibility of individual access in relation to the rider on the white horse. But it says relatively easily, and apparently it was so during World War II, that there was sufficient massed intent in World War II, apparently. So, sorry. No. There was sufficient massed intent at that critical moment in World War II. Right. And that moment would have been the moment when humanity might have gone down to destruction as the hierarchy itself thought it would. The rider comes forth from the center wherein the love of God is held for distribution as the human center, which we call humanity, becomes attuned to true love and can identify itself with all men, responding freely and without any inhibition to divine love, understanding, and effective, skillful activity. So this is basically, this rider comes forth from hierarchy and not from Shamballa. I mean, this is acquainting us so deeply with the meaning of this invocation and the principal beings involved that we will certainly use it with more effectiveness and intelligence. When this invocation is rightly used and voiced by an adequate number of people, so indeed, numbers count, those who can, in some measure, employ the enlightened will may succeed in reaching the Lords of Liberation and, as a result, a phenomenal intervention of some kind. Now, have we noticed something here? For quite a number of pages, DK has been preparing us to understand divine intervention. For many pages, DK has been preparing us to understand divine intervention. It is an intervention from the rider on the white horse. It is perhaps an intervention from the Lords of Liberation, who were and are more powerful than the rider on the white horse, and whose interposition was needed, basically, to save humanity. So we might say, we can here, the Lords of Liberation saved humanity after humanity's intensity of invocation was sufficient. Those who work more emotionally will reach the rider from the secret place and may bring him forth to save and lead the masses of people. Now there, we have those who approach religion from an emotional point of view. So, the average congregants of our various world religions. Are there enough focused minds and intense, attentive hearts to reach the two centers where wait those who can aid at this time? Well, that's, it hadn't happened yet, right? It had not happened. And I'm sure, much to the relief of hierarchy, it happened, though the law was being followed. And think of it, Master DK gave out an invocation to the Lords of Liberation, not knowing whether it could be successful. But he did focus the invocatory cry of humanity. He focused it. Now that is the question. It will happen when the three centers, humanity, the spiritual hierarchy of the planet, and the place where the will of God lies hidden, called in the ancient scriptures Shamballa, are aligned and on rapport with each other. There will then be established a direct relation between all three and a direct channel for the inflow of liberating force. This has happened only once before in the history of humanity. The human beings would have had to have been of some caliber in order to make this happen, and in Atlantis they were quite strictly emotional. So when was this? We might say, when? Put the question up and see if we can answer it. So it will happen. So alignment needed. Alignment is needed for this to happen. And, DK is putting it forth as kind of a hope without truly knowing how humanity will react, owing to the fact that mankind is so weakened by pain, strain, and suffering. The probability is, now notice that's so interesting, the probability is that it will not be deemed wise for the Lords of Liberation directly to contact humanity, and they will probably do three things. Okay, maybe we'll find out what they did do and if there was direct contact or not. Certainly there was effective contact, and all I can say from what DK has said is that for the time being, humanity was saved. So what can they do? Maybe, number one, stand behind and strengthen the rider on the white horse as he responds to the demand of the people everywhere, pouring through him that dynamic energy which embodies the first divine aspect, the will aspect, the power expression. Thus they will enable him to carry out the will of God in such a manner that humanity can grasp what is being done. Mankind will then see the love which animates the will and power of God. The true significance of liberty will then be revealed. It is not yet understood. Well, it appears, from what I can understand, that this method was not used. Why do I say that? Because, let's see if I can put it forth. Okay, so probably not used as the avatar of synthesis and the spirit of peace, and the Buddha were the chosen agencies to surround the Christ and pour through him their energies. Okay, well, maybe more than three can pour energies through the Christ, but we are specifically given the idea that three form that triangle, and it would be yet another triangle if the Lords of Liberation worked through the Christ. Now, it seemed to be a very, very strong will aspect involving the first and fifth rays, the rays on which the Black Lodge works. And so the Lords of Liberation, especially the first one, countered that Black Lodge tendency, that way of working with the first and fifth ray, which could have brought destruction to all the sponsors of the way of light. Here's another way. Pour their strengthening will to good into the new group of world servers in all lands, so that there may be potent simultaneous action in line with the purposes of the rider from the secret place. Now, some of all this may yet happen, you know. Some of these methods may still be used, but what was the drastic method used to save humanity when even hierarchy thought humanity would go down? Maybe, maybe the improbable happened. Okay, so this is, let's call this working with the new group of world servers. And this is working through the Christ or coming one or rider. All right, and this other, let's see, number 3. Stimulate and integrate the minds of certain advanced disciples into the minds of certain disciples a number of new ideals which must govern the liberating process for the new age. Well, yes, but let's just say the fifth ray ashram, so FFA, FFRA, so we'll call it the fifth ray. The fifth ray ashram was so stimulated that atomic energy, the knowledge of atomic energy used in weaponry could be appropriated by them, was greatly stimulated to make the atomic weapon. Now, okay, this method was done in a small way at the time of the French Revolution, when the 3 major concepts of freedom were expressed in 3 words: liberty, equality, fraternity. And notice that, and were intellectually presented to the race and intellectually presented. Notice that freedom controls them all, probably being preeminent. And this in itself constitutes an important symbolic happening. It had to occur because these 3 words stood for no factual truth, but simply for a hope and for an academic concept. The events of the last few months reduced them to a farce. So they were deliberately withdrawn in order to enhance their importance, and will later be restored and will then assume a new and potent significance in the minds of men. They are the 3 words which must govern the new age. And that's interesting because, we're dealing with an air sign and 3 air signs to which these words are directly related. So with the fall of France, I suppose, nobody was speaking these words: liberty, equality, fraternity. The forces of evil had so overcome those responses, positive impulses, that they could not be used. There was no liberty, there was no equality, there was no fraternity, but later to emerge. And maybe we are in the time, well, certainly liberty was achieved. There are so many battles now in the question related to the question of equality. Equality does not exist on the level of form, but monadically it does. And fraternity, brotherhood, is a great monadic relation. So anyway, they are the 3 words which must govern the new age, and that's important to remember: liberty, equality, fraternity. And, in French they sound very much as they do in English. Certain racial interpretations of ideas will also have to disappear in order to be succeeded by new and better ones. This applies even to man's understanding of the 3 words which we have been considering. Liberty, as the lords of liberation may endorse it, is in reality the recognition of right human relations, freely adjusted, willingly undertaken, and motivated by a sense of responsibility which will act as a protective wall. Now, this is so interesting. Okay, I'll do it that way. And I'll increase the size of how liberty is to be understood, and who would think of it that way. A recognition of right human relations. Maybe that would be more assigned to equality or fraternity, but okay, it's assigned to liberty here, freely adjusted, willingly undertaken, and motivated by a sense of responsibility which will act as a protective wall. This will take place not through coercive measures, but through correct interpretation and quick apprehension by the masses, who are apt to confound license, personality, freedom to do as the lower nature chooses, and liberty of the soul and conscience. Okay, so a basic confusion is here between license and liberty. So the distinction between and liberty must be understood by the masses. And so far it is not. And here is license, and here is liberty. Okay. Yet this liberty is the easiest aspect of the divine will for humanity to grasp. It is in reality the first revelation given to man of the nature of the will of God and of the quality of Shamballa. Now that's so important, and that's why perhaps this great being representing liberty is the one who is closest to humanity, because his time is imminent. And the others, well, let's see what he says. Equality is that peculiar understanding which the coming one will reveal, and which is based on a right sense of proportion, correct self-respect, capital S, and understanding of the spiritual yet natural laws of rebirth and of cause and effect, and which will be founded in future centuries on the recognition of the age of a soul's experience. Notice not the age of the soul per se, because all souls are ageless, basically, being one with true being and its consciousness. So it will be founded on the recognition of the age of the soul's experience and gain development, and not at all on the loud, emphatic affirmation that all men are equal. I guess without understanding reincarnation, can we understand with any accuracy the idea that all men are equal? Well, let's just say all men are created equal, all men are emanated equal. What shall it be? But they certainly do not manifest with equality because of the recognition of because there is such a thing as the age of the soul's experience and gain development. Maybe this has been done not because one soul is more capable than the next, but simply because of the use made of free will or not made. Now, fraternity is something that humanity itself will contribute as an expression of the third aspect of divinity, basing it on right contact and right reaction to contact. It's not in the sequence. The progressive sequence would be Aquarius, Gemini, fraternity, equality, Libra. But they are out of zodiacal order, so to speak. Yeah. Thus, there will be developed gradually the true life theme of humanity, which is brotherhood, founded on divine origin, equality, and leading to a free and true expression of divinity, liberty. A true life theme, which is brotherhood, and what can we call that? Let's call that fraternity. So this is a very important concluding section right here. I'm just a little bit appalled by how much time I spent on those mathematical speculations when in fact they're, out of reach. Anyway, perhaps with these thoughts in mind, this first stanza of the new invocation will assume more importance, and you will then be able intelligently to invoke those who can inspire to right action, thus bringing succor, and call forth the one who can save the situation through right leadership, the rider. Okay, and the lords. All right, now what I'm going to do, friends, since there's so much more here, and what time is it here? Let's see how this works, because we come to, well, no, as much as I'm tempted to go on, we have to be ready. So this is the end of approximately 2 hours. And we'll find out how much I'm off, because my chronometer has entered a state of rebellion, which I suppose means liberty for it did not want to submit to my control. So, okay, this is page 272, and we began at 258. So I'm hoping that I'm able to see where we really are. Okay, I've managed to catch up with this now, and we're ending program number 26, which is very approximately a 2-hour program. And we are moving ahead when we can to program number 27, and that will deal with the end of the description of the rider. I would like to go ahead, but I'm afraid that even though there's not so much, it will take necessary preparation time away from the full moon broadcast. So, okay, everybody, thank you very much for attending and reading and thinking together as we really pore over some of the deeper meanings of this second great invocation that the Lords of Liberation issue forth. Let them bring succor to what? Okay. I think to the sons of men, succor to the sons of men, let the rider from the secret place come forth, and coming save. Come forth, O mighty one. So we've dealt now with the Lords of Liberation working through Shamballa, and we've dealt with the rider and those who can reach him. We've also dealt with the Lords of Liberation and how they can be reached. So that'll be it for the moment, and we'll see you a little bit later. Lots of love, many blessings, deep study, deep meditation, effective application. See you before long.